Well, hello. We are in Daniel chapter 8, and we're continuing. Where we left off was Daniel had this dream, and we were talking about this part of the dream, Daniel chapter 8, and this is, I think, starts at verse 5. But there's this dream that involves a ram, a two-horned ram, and a goat. And the goat is coming up against the ram. Now, we've already discussed part of this. I'm just reviewing this now so we can continue forward, because I think you're going to find this study fascinating tonight. We're going to parse exactly what this is talking about, who this goat is. And again, we started last time, and it's interesting just to hear what this is about. And then after we go through all of this, we've got a lot to go through, we're going to read those passages again that we're going to bring up right here and see if it makes a lot of sense. You can just decode Scripture right in front of yourself when you read it again. So let's start. We're going to break into a thought here. This ram was come up against by this goat. And it says the ram, this is Daniel chapter 8, and I think this is verse 7. But it says the ram was powerless to stand against him, the goat. And the goat knocked him to the ground and trampled on him. Now, this is a two-horned ram. Remember, it's two horns. This is all about horns here. The goat became very great, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off. Now, you got to remember these details. Everything is detailed we're going to discuss. So this goat defeats the ram. He becomes very great in power after that. But then his large horn, of his two, the larger horn, broke off. And in its place, 4, not 1, not 2, not 3, not 5, 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Now, we're going to talk about that. Just remember those details. We discussed already, and I just said it, I think, a couple of times now, that the ram, the two-horned ram, is the Medo-Persian Empire. So you'll remember that in this image of Nebuchadnezzar, we see that the Medo-Persian Empire indeed was defeated and followed on by the Empire of Bronze, which is the Greek Empire. This is really what this is talking about. So the goat is going to be the genesis of the Greek Empire, which is the well-known Alexander the Great. And so you probably already know that, but there's a lot of interesting facts here, because then Alexander the Great comes to power. His large horn of greatness, of power, of dominion is broken off, and in its place come 4 prominent horns, and we're going to talk about those here. Moving down to Daniel chapter 8 and verse 20 to 22, here we see a classic example of the Bible interpreting itself, because now what I just discussed with you is going to be told to us, or to Daniel, right here, dropping down to Daniel chapter 8 and verse 20. The two-horned ram, it had horns of equal length, that you saw, Daniel, you saw, represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece. We just said that. And the large horn between his eyes is the first king. That would be Alexander the Great. He was the beginning of the Hellenization of the world, the Greek Empire. The 4 horns that replaced the one that was broken off represents 4 kingdoms that will emerge from his, Alexander's, nation, but they will not have the same power. These following kings, these 4 kings, we're going to talk about them right now, were in the line of the Hellenistic kings, descended from General Antigonus, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, after his death. But nonetheless, this is a whole line that started with Alexander the Great. So what this is basically telling us here is, and this is a few hundred years in the future, Alexander the Great comes, he begins the Hellenization of the world, he conquers the world, and when he dies, 4 others take his place and start their own kingdoms. We're going to talk about that. The goat clearly denotes Greece, and we know that because we can look at history. Even though the Bible just interpreted this for us, it said the king of Greece, but it didn't say it was Alexander the Great. But why did God decide to use an image of a goat when he could have used any animal with horns if he wanted to, but he used a goat for Greece? Well, here's why. The goat clearly denotes Greece, and the first and great horn is Alexander the Great. The capital city of Greece in that day was named Aegis. It's spelled Aegis. And what does this mean? It means the city of the goat, believe it or not. And again, this is how you know that the Bible's is true. When you study, it's still fascinating to me, because this is the second time I'm teaching this in detail. And it's still fascinating to me that you study history and it corroborates Scripture. It's so wonderful. And it was pre-written in the Bible before it happened. And so these symbols are phenomenal. So let's talk about what is said about this in Greek mythology. The Aegis was a weapon of Zeus and Athena, so that's probably why they named that city after these, because after this Aegis, because it was a weapon of Zeus, so they wanted that city to be great. And of course, their main god was Zeus. By the way, in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, it talks about the throne of Satan. And Pergamum's throne was Satan. That was the throne of Zeus, the temple of Zeus, rather. Zeus is a prominent god and actually is equivalent to Satan. Think of the power of Zeus in their pantheon of gods as the main god of this world, Satan. And that's who they worship. So Aegis was a weapon of Zeus and his loved one, Athena. It possessed the power to terrify and disperse the enemy or to protect its friends, the olive branch and the gun. The Aegis was usually described as a garment made of goatskin, slung over the shoulder, or as a piece of armor. The Aegis of Athena was a breastplate covered with goatskin and bordered with snakes. Go figure. You think they knew something? You think they knew who they were worshiping? It was bordered with snakes, bearing in the center the head of Medusa. Again, you probably heard of Medusa as one of these goddesses. And the history of Medusa was that she was once a beautiful woman, but she offended Athena and was cursed. So Athena had her hair changed into snakes. You getting the picture here? Snakes, reptilian, Satan, goat. By the way, if you've seen the Baphomet lately, because it's coming to bear now, Baphomet all over the place, it's the head of a goat, an inverted star, like the Freemasons use and others. I'm not going to get into all that, but it's inverted because it looks like a goat with horns. It's a symbol of Satan, and the same thing with the Baphomet. Amazing, right? So anyway, she changed her hair into snakes and made her face so hideous. Now listen to this. You don't want to meet Medusa, because it made her face so hideous that all who looked at her were turned to stone. Now think of this, again, a loose analogy, but it may have something to do with the story of Lot's wife. When Lot and his wife and his family were taken out of Sodom pretty much forcibly just before the sulfur rained down. But his wife looked back longingly at the city, and she turned to salt, but she was petrified. Alexander the Great had a son. Guess what his name was? Aegis, the son of the goat. Go figure. You know, history, I don't know history, but maybe we could say folklore history holds that Alexander's mother, and I found this out, I mean, this is not, I'm making this up, and again, I can't verify this, but it's written of, and we can see that there's a consciousness here. There's a consciousness of Satan. There's a consciousness of him and who he is, and the fallen angels that are helping Greece become a prominent structure in the world that Satan runs. That Alexander the Great's mother had said to Alexander that his father was a serpent. This is something you can look up and find out. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. But if it is true or if it's not true, the fact is that it had to even be said. It's probably been said a long time ago, but I really truly believe, and especially reading this, that Alexander the Great knew who his head was and was doing his father's bidding. And there's a lot of trouble that came from that, and we're going to continue to see that. In Greek mythology also, there was a satyr god named Pan. Now, you've probably heard of Pan. I think there was a movie. Yes, there is a movie because I saw it years ago about Pan, who was half man and half goat, who played a pipe made of reeds called a syrinx, or also known as a panpipe. Now, think of this. He played a pipe. He was a musician. What was one of the major features of Satan when God created him? He was perfect in his beauty. He was also perfect in his musical ability, right? He was basically designed as a musical instrument, and he was used to praise God and worship. So he's got a very high level of musical prowess, and you hear that in the disgusting music that's pretty catchy all throughout the ages that tries to steer people emotionally toward him and his ways. A little more about Pan. Pan had great masculinity and procreative power. Again, you see how these gods are formed into the likeness of what these men knew they should be to mimic Satan, who they worship. Procreative power and veracity and strong will. By the way, that's what they said about Alexander the Great, too. And Alexander the Great possessed these things for sure, because if you look at his history, there's very few people in this world, maybe the Herods in sort of their way, and maybe some others, but none have conquered the world and did the things that Alexander the Great did in such a short life. He died at, I think, 33. We'll talk more about that as we go. So let's continue here. Let's review now Daniel 8, 19 to 22. Daniel 8, 19 to 22. He said, this is now the angel talking to Daniel, I am going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia, which we just were told. And again, here's a scripture interpreting itself. 21. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, which we just talked about. And the large horn between his eyes is the first king, Alexander the Great, of the Grecian Empire that was formed. Then verse 22. The four horns that replaced the one that was broken off, represents four kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, Alexander's nation, but will not have the same power. And they didn't, but they still continued. There were four of them, remember, and there were four ordinal positions on the compass. Basically, they still spread around the world, and they did. So we're going to talk about that a little more. Let's finish up with Alexander before we moved on to those who succeeded him. I hope you're following all this well. So Alexander the Great, yes, he did live about 33 years, from 356 to 323 BC. But during that time, he became one of the most successful military commanders in human history. Just like I said, he conquered a vast region that had been occupied by the earlier empires. Egyptian Empire, the Assyrians, of course the Babylonians, and the Persians. And again, if you look at the statue of Nebuchadnezzar, you will see that all of them except Egypt, and we discussed a long time ago why Egypt isn't in this list of Gentile empires, but I don't want to get into all that now. But you can see that this is where we are. So we had the Babylonian Empire, was conquered by Darius the Mede and the Persia, and then Alexander the Great, that goat, comes and conquers the ram, the two-horned ram, Media and Persia. So now we're in the Bronze period of 330 BC. From 356 to 323 BC is certainly when Alexander the Great ruled and conquered the known world. We continue on. A little bit of history about Alexander. Alexander was the son of King Philip II of Macedon in 336 BC at age 20. Now, he was only 20 years old. He assumed command of the Greek army. After putting down a rebellion in Greece, he began an eastward military campaign that quickly made him the ruler of the earth from Greece to India, where, according to some accounts, he sat down and wept because he had run out of world to conquer. And that was the beginning of his decline. I'm just going to read this here. Remember what Daniel said about Alexander in Daniel 8, verse 5. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between his eyes came from the west. And we just heard, historically, he traveled east. Came from the west, crossing the whole world without touching the ground. He and his army, when he became the leader of that army, he traveled so fast, was basically carpet bombing people, was steamrolling them as he traveled from Greece eastward, that they had no time to even begin to defend themselves, and he overran peoples after peoples. And I'm going to read you an excerpt from good old Josephus, one of my favorite writers, about the histories of the Jews and other things about this. He died suddenly at age 33 from quote-unquote an unknown illness. Now, that's questionable. The history says, now again, I'm not going to say history holds because no one really knows for sure, and even Josephus wrote about it, and others. They say that he had a sort of syphilis or some other STD type thing that did him in. I really don't know. No one really knows, but we do know that he died suddenly. It's interesting, though, with the way he died. We'll talk about that maybe a little bit more in a minute. He died from an unknown illness, and all of a sudden, he was gone, so the kingdom was divided up into 4 pieces. And that's what the book of Daniel just tells us right now. And these 4 pieces were actually 4 generals. But listen to this. The book of Daniel was written approximately 250 years before Alexander the Great was even born. So you've got to say 250 years plus 20 years for him to even be coming on the scene in a general way and then do what he did until age 33. And yet, Daniel is given a description of him in amazing detail, which I'm sharing with you right here. And I'm reading the scriptures to you, and you've probably read some of this yourself if you read the book of Daniel. But now you see, when you take history and you compare it to the Bible, it always proves the Bible, and it still gives me goosebumps because the Bible is just amazing. It is the Word of God. It proves God and all the things that you and we all know is the case. Anyway, the 4 horns that replace the broken horns. Now start thinking about this. Okay, Alexander dies, and he dies of a questionable disease. I want to tell you something else about Alexander, which is very, very interesting. We'll get to that in a second. Just before he dies, and again, history does hold this, and it's very interesting, and I want you to think about this. So the 4 horns that proceed from him are Cassander. He was given power over Macedonia, which is actually Greek, Macedonia, which is Greece itself. Lysimachus was given over to Asia Minor. I'll say it like a New Yorker, Asia Minor. He is given Asia Minor, and he follows on, and I want you to keep this in mind, because when I read you something from the book of The Antiquity of the Jews by Josephus about the history as recorded about this, you're going to hear of a man named Antigonus, and actually you may be confused because he's talked about as being in line of those that proceeded from Alexander the Great after he passed away. But Lysimachus follows Antigonus, and I'm going to read you something about that. So it's a little detail, it doesn't really matter that much, but really things that you need to understand what the Bible's talking about, these 4 horns, the prominent horns. Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus. Now this is the key one. He was given the land that stretched from east of Asia Minor to India and south into the Holy Land, into the Asian territory. Now I have a map here I'm going to show you. This is the Hellenistic world as it proceeded, or as it was organized post-Alexandrian Empire world, I guess you could say. So you can take a look at the map while I'm talking about this. Seleucus was given a land that stretched from east of Asia Minor to India, south, and into the Holy Land, the Assyrian territory, because there was still a divided kingdom going on here, and into the Holy Land, which included Israel. We'll talk more about that. Ptolemy, given power over North Africa, all of Egypt, Libya, Ethiopia, and into the Straits of Gibraltar. These generals divided the world into these 4 parts, in these 4 general areas, and this is notable because one of these generals is very interesting from a prophetic point of view, and we're going to talk about one of them for sure, and I just mentioned who that would be. The main purpose of this chapter in Daniel is to focus on Israel and the coming Antichrist, and that's what we need to always remember. The Bible only discusses, especially the Old Testament, only discusses nations and peoples of that day by the names of that day, or by names of peoples that are listed in the Bible before that particular time, but nonetheless, peoples and nations as only when they come into contact or affect Israel as a nation or its peoples in some way, shape, or form. And that's why even when you move into the New Testament, you will find references to nations that their names have changed and so forth, but you do not see much history about other nations. Like, for instance, when you're looking at this map, you see there are many other nations, especially by their current names, like Russia at the top, Iraq, Iran. By the way, you know Iran, it says there is Persia. Persia is mentioned in the Bible very prominently because it does affect Israel a lot, and it's affecting Israel a lot now, and it's going to affect Israel a lot, into the near future too, Syria and so forth. So that's why sometimes you'll hear historical facts, especially when we read them from other sources, but you may not see in the Bible that it gives you more detail because it doesn't have to. So when it says that these generals conquered these other places, you have to just take it with the idea that the Bible's not going to be descriptive about that, because the Bible really wants to teach us about God's plan for Israel, how those nations interact with Israel, how God uses his nations to affect Israel and affect his plan. And that's this long-running timeline that also affects his plan for the ages and affects us here at this time in the church age. Anyway, having said that, Here's a little interesting factoid about Alexander, who knew who his father was. Listen to this. Now, you remember Babylon. You remember Nimrod and the Tower of Babel and all of that. I don't have to explain that to you because you know that. That was the key inflection point that really started the Gentile world system. This system that we're in now, the economic and religious mystery Babylon system. Okay, and that was a major inflection point because it was at that time that the world was of one language and pretty much of one culture until that. And God stopped the tower. He didn't destroy it, and he didn't destroy those people. He confounded their languages, and then they eventually left because they couldn't communicate anymore. And that started the cultures and the nations that, like you see in this map here, and even to today. You have different peoples, different cultures, different languages, from the Tower of Babel. And that's the Gentile system, the mixed up system that we have since then. Well, Alexander knew about these things because after conquering the known world, he decides to go set up his throne, guess where? In Babylon. Why did he do that? Well, while there, he becomes severely depressed. And this is getting to the end of his life because there is no more world left to conquer. He comes up with the idea that now he'll conquer heaven. And remember, Nimrod built a city and a tower. He built more than one city. Actually, the city of Sodom was also built by Nimrod too, if you want to know that. So all of these evil cities, a couple of other cities. But the main feature of Babylon, of the city there, was the fact that he built this tower to reach heaven. What he was trying to do was reconnect with the gods of old, the pre-Noahic flood, when there was a system that was prominent. Now, a lot of people, except for Noah, most people, the world was populated pretty well in Noah's day, and they were being given blessings, and they were also being driven by these gods to destroy the world and to take over. And after the flood, it was happening again, and Nimrod was trying to reconnect with those gods. That's the fact. That's what happened. So he must have known this. Alexander went to Babylon, and history holds, he removed the debris from the ruins of the original Tower of Babel in Babylon. Remember, God never actually destroyed it. He just stopped it building, and over time, it collapsed, but it was still there, what was left of it. And he was going to seek to rebuild it. It was about this time that he died. Interesting little factoid for you. I'm going to read to you an excerpt from this big book Josephus wrote. This is actually two of his books. And Josephus was a very prominent writer. If you know Josephus, he said a lot of things, and he said it over and over and over again, but he said a lot of good things. So I'm going to read you a little bit here. It's a little bit of a passage. It's going to give you an idea of what happened right after Alexander passed on and the political intrigue here. Here we go. This is book 11 of the Antiquities of the Jews. Now, this is an unabridged version. You can find, if you're interested, abridged versions, and actually a paperback. This is the entire treasure trove of what he wrote. It's a heavy book, and you got to be selective about what you're reading. Anyway, so here it is. This is book 11, containing the interval of 170 years from the death of Alexander the Great to the death of Judas Maccabeus, which, if you know that history, we're going to talk about that because this is a follow-on piece that Daniel talks about too as we move toward the coming Antichrist and the line of the Antichrist. So, chapter 1 here, I'm going to just read you this excerpt. It says, How Ptolemy, the son of Lagus, took Jerusalem and Judea by deceit and treachery, and carried many of the Jews thence, and planted them in Egypt. Now, again, Daniel's not talking specifically about this, but this is a setup. Okay, and I just want you to think about this. Now, when Alexander, king of Macedon, had put an end to the dominion of the Persians, which we know he did, he was the goat that destroyed the ram, so he's saying right here, history held, by the time Josephus was born and writing this, that was all past history, so it was already proven what had happened. He's just reporting it. So he had put down an end to the Persians, and had settled affairs in Judea, after the aforementioned manner, which he talks about this previously, we don't have to read that. He ended his life, or his life ended, really, is what it's saying here. So Alexander the Great dies. And as his government fell among many, now we're getting to these four little horns that rise up out of the broken horn. Antigonus, remember I told you Antigonus was there, and then Lysimachus came after him. So that's why I said it mentions Antigonus here, but don't be confused. Fell among many. Antigonus obtained Asia, Seleucus, Babylon, and the other nations which were there. See, this is all forming. Lysimachus governed the Hellespont, which I'm not going to get into that right now. I was going to, but I wouldn't have time for that. And Cassander. Now, you remember these names. Remember, I asked you to remember these names. These are the names I mentioned as the 4 generals that came in right after Alexander. And you can see right there on that map. Symmachus governed the Hellespont, and Cassander possessed Macedonia, which is Greece itself. As did Ptolemy, the son of Lagus, seize upon Egypt. And while there, these princes ambitiously strove one against the other. And history holds that these 4 generals and Antigonus, they fought hard to see who was going to come out as the next Alexander the Great. But listen to this. They ambitiously strove one against another, every one for his own principality. Look at the map. It came to pass that there were continual wars, and those lasting wars too. This was a mess, and this is, by the way, what is going to happen at the end, right? The Antichrist. There's going to be wars and wars and rumors of wars, and it's going to continue unto the end. That's exactly what Jesus said. Well, this is a repeating cycle of history that we show prophecy is true. Think of that. And the cities were sufferers, and the innocent always suffers, and lost a great many of their inhabitants in these times of distress generated by these guys. Insomuch that all Syria, by the means of Ptolemy, the son of Lagus, underwent the reverse of that denomination of Savior which he then had. So really, if you think about it, what this seems to be saying is a side note, because the people who would have read this in Josephus' day would have known about this, that Syria, if you look at the Bible, is prominent, especially in the New Testament times, and this is when Josephus was around, was very prominent with converted people coming to Christ in the age of the church. It was also, even in the days of the Old Testament, Syria was prominent with a lot of Jews. As a matter of fact, Paul, even in the New Testament, was on his way to Damascus. There was a lot of it going on in Syria for both Jew and the church as well. By that time, he's saying that he started leading them astray, those people there, and destroying their faith in Christ. That's what it seems to be saying. But listen to this. He also seized upon Jerusalem, and for that end made use of a deceit and treachery, as he came into the city on a Sabbath day, as if he would offer sacrifices. He's tricking them. He, without any trouble, gained the city, while the Jews did not oppose him, for they did not suspect him to be their enemy. You see, this is the target, Jerusalem. And he gained it thus because they were free from suspicion of him, because they thought he was going to do sacrifices, and because on that day they were at rest on the Sabbath. By the way, if you've ever heard of the 1973 Yom Kippur War, that's when Egypt and the other countries decided to all attack Israel at that time, because they attacked them on a special Sabbath, and they knew that they would not be expecting the attack. That's what he did here. And you know what's going to happen in the future? The same thing. And it goes on here. By the way, he leads them to Egypt and settles them there. There's a lot of history that the Bible doesn't really even talk about. I think that's probably all I'm going to read from here. Let's move forward. Alexander the Great. We read that now the political intrigue starting. You see in the map here. It is said that Alexander's general, Ptolemy, which we just mentioned, took his body to Egypt for burial. Now we know that he went to Egypt. He took the Jews to Egypt. We just read there. So he's in Egypt, and he's conquering Egypt. He's making Egypt a big deal. He conquers Jerusalem and starts bringing the Jews over there, which we just read. He's bringing Alexander's body for burial there. Now, guess what? In 1995, this tomb was discovered to be there. It is in a place called Siwa Oasis. And it is in Egypt at the corner of, if you look at it, the northwest Egyptian border at Libya. I don't have a map to show you, but you'll just have to picture it in your mind or look it up if you're interested. But interesting here, though. It was in the Siwa Oasis and at the place called the Oracle of Ammon Zeus, which was their main god. So there you go, the Oracle of Zeus. Okay? It's just a thought. Let's go back to Daniel chapter 8. The overriding theme in verses 8 and 9 and those following, which depict the death of Alexander and the rise of the 4 generals, that's what this is about, and that's what I'm detailing here for you. But listen to this. Out of those 4 generals rises a little horn. Let's read Daniel chapter 8 and verse 9. Out of them came another horn, which started small, but grew in power to the south and to the east and to the beautiful land. Now, my translation says capital B, capital L. Beautiful land. That's Israel. Now think of that. Out of these horns came another one which started small but grew in power. Now think of that. If you know the book of Daniel at all, you'll also know that the Antichrist, when he's talked about, is a little horn that comes out of the 10 horns, the 10 nations that are going to be formed at the very end now, very soon now. And there's going to be a little horn that's the Antichrist. Well, again, this is a foretype of that. Think of it this way when I continue here. Who Daniel is talking about, very interestingly, is, and if you know history, you'll know this guy because he was a main feature of the history of the Jews, is Antiochus Epiphanes of the house of Seleucid. And he was a type of the Antichrist. Now, you know what he did. If you don't, we're going to discuss it. But he did, and the Antichrist will do the abomination that causes desolation, which Jesus said was spoken of by Daniel the prophet, which when Daniel is talking about the coming Antichrist, he talks about him moving into the third temple, which is not built yet, but it's going to be built soon. He's going to move in there 3.5 years into the tribulation and say that he is God. Well, guess who did something really similar to that? That little horn that he's talking about here, the forerunner to the big little horn, the final little horn, Antiochus Epiphanes. Let's talk about this. I hope you're seeing the gravity of the situation here. General Seleucus began a ruling dynasty called the Seleucid dynasty. Seleucid is a title, just as Darius and Herod are titles. Antiochus is a title as well. There were many of them, but we're talking about a specific Antiochus here. Note that there were a total of about 13 Antiochuses, but again, we're talking about Antiochus the Fourth, which is also known as Antiochus Epiphanes. He is the one that we're talking about. Now, remember that Daniel 8:9 says that this little horn went to the south, to the east, and toward the beautiful land. Just take a look at this map. It's not a very detailed map, but you can see what is going on here if you look at it. So to the south, he was given rule over what we now today call Syria, Iraq, and Iran, what in the ancient world was Syria and Assyria. And to the east, to the Ganges River in India, which runs east from the southern border of China to the southern end of Bangladesh. Remember, chapter 8 we're in right now, but chapter 7 introduces the Antichrist. Now, you may not remember this if you're new, but we've talked about this a lot. What I want to show you is at the very top here in this display, you will see that the chronological order of the books, where chapters 7 and 8 are chronologically in order, and then chapters 5 and 6 and 9, see, it's out of order. So just take a look at that. Remember that, okay? Chapter 8 is after chapter 7, which is logical, because chapter 8 furthers the theme of the coming Prince of Darkness, which was talked about in chapter 7. That's why here it's talking about a very key forerunner to the Antichrist in type, which is Antiochus Epiphanes, coming out of Alexander the Great, his 4 generals, the Seleucid dynasty. You see the progression of history, and the Bible mapped this out 250 years before Alexander the Great was even born. Chapter 8 occurs 15 years before chapter 7. As a matter of fact, let me go back to that chronology here. It's interesting while we're looking at that. Chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12 speak to the time of the final Antichrist to come, which is very soon now. Just about the last half of the book of Daniel centers on the future man of sin. Now, we know that there was an interim man of sin, but we know that also in our modern day, there are less prominent, but still prominent enough foretypes of the coming Antichrist. If you look at what they did, Hitler was one of them. There's a few others. I want to read you something if you want to follow. It's just really a quick verse. I'd really rather have you just listen. Back in the Old Testament, in the book of Micah, chapter 5, verse 5, and I'm going to read this from the Amplified Version. Now listen to this. And this one shall be our peace. When the Assyrian comes into our lands and treads upon our soil. Now remember, you have to look at the names of the nations and the places in Assyria and understand what that means. When we know that Antiochus IV Epiphanes was given Syria and Assyria, just think of this. This one shall be our peace. There's a capital O on the one, by the way. When the Assyrian comes into our lands and treads upon our soil and in our palaces, then we will raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 princes among them. Now, we don't know who those shepherds and princes are, at least right now, at least I don't. But we do know that this one is Messiah. So this is sort of prophetic from that time, because this is still in the Old Testament, and it's looking at a place called Assyria. So you can put this all together and see kind of what he's talking about here. The original Assyrian was Seleucus, All of his dynastic successors controlled the land that was called Assyria. Now, out of the Assyrian dynasty came Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who in 168 BC, so this is getting pretty close now to the time of Jesus. And this is history that Daniel's mapping centuries and centuries ago. In 168 BC, he comes in and he overthrows the temple, profaned it. He put in there a statue of Zeus. Now, I told you who Zeus is. I told you what he exemplifies. The real Antichrist, the coming Antichrist, is going to be Zeus. And he's going to say he is that God, and he will be the one to bring himself into the temple at that time when the third temple is built, which is going to be very soon now. You know, you've been following anything, you know that they're ready to build this thing. And that peace plan is coming and all these things. We are right at the cusp, but I'm showing you that the Bible proves, and we as Christians need to know this, and that's why we're here studying this. This is really the crux here. Antiochus Epiphanes is an exact foretype, and this is who Jesus was referring to when he was talking about the abomination that causes desolation that Daniel the prophet spoke of, and that's this here. History's doomed to repeat itself. Let's talk about this. Matthew 24, verses 15 through 21, if you want to turn there. This is Jesus speaking now. Remember of the exact things we just talked about, of Antiochus IV Epiphanes and the coming Antichrist, and what one was famous for, and the history of the Maccabees and the rededication, and Hanukkah was the rededication of the temple after it was cleansed. You may or may not know that history. I'm not going to get into it here. But this was a big deal back then, and it's going to be a bigger deal when it comes to fruition. History is Fibonacci. Prophecy shows that history is Fibonacci in structure, which means that if you know the Fibonacci sequence, if you look at a seashell or like a snail shell or something like that, it's the same pattern that starts out small, and as it progresses or grows, it's the same pattern, but it gets more convoluted and bigger and bigger and bigger, and there's a lot of symmetry, but you'll see that this is exactly what he's talking about. So it's going to happen again, but it's going to be worse. Listen to this, Matthew 24:15. So when you see standing in the holy place, this is Jesus talking, the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Now, you and I can understand because he's commanding us to understand, and you can see that you can't understand this unless you know Jewish history, you know secular history, and you know about these things. That's what he's saying. We are to understand, and so we do understand now. Let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. We'll be gone at this time, but the Jews will still be here, and they will think he is their Messiah until they realize, we made a mistake. Because when he moves into that temple and 3.5 years into the 7-year tribulation, and he says, I am God, he stops the daily sacrifices, which is going to start when that temple is rebuilt. This is what's going to happen. We're not going to be here for this. We will be raptured. Those of us who are Christian, those of us who are not, won't be here to see this. That's how soon it's coming. Then let those in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the roof of his house go down to take anything out of the house. You just get out. Don't take anything. Just leave. You don't have time. It is critical. When he does that, you got to go. Verse 18, let no one in the field go back to take his cloak. Drop everything you're doing and run. This is the urgency Jesus is talking about when the Antichrist proves who he is. And what does he capstone this with? How dreadful it will be in those days, yet future, but not too future from now, for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in the winter on the Sabbath. Why? Because it is very difficult to travel, even in Israel, in the winter, and especially if they're keeping the laws, the Mosaic laws, on the Sabbath. It's going to be very difficult to move. You're not going to find transportation that easily because people will be keeping the Sabbath. In the winter, it's difficult to move because of the weather. So he's saying, just pray that when this happens, it's not too difficult for you just to drop everything and get out. Get out! For then there will be great distress. How great? Unequaled. From the beginning of the world until that very time. You ain't seen nothing yet. And he says, and it will never be equaled again. And of this time, Jesus also says that if he doesn't come and cut those days short, no flesh would be saved alive. Well, Antiochus Epiphanes started that. The Antichrist, the real Antichrist, is going to wrap that up. Going back to Daniel, Daniel is telling us of the family lineage of the Antichrist. Alexander the Great, through the Seleucids, on to Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV Epiphanes. These form the special lineage to become the people of the prince that shall come, small p, Antichrist, the one who is going to be the fake prince of the people. So look at this. You see that the Greek and the Roman Empire, now if you know history of the New Testament, you know Rome was followed on from Greece, and they're pretty closely related, very closely related. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the things in the Roman government, the Roman style of government, the things they did was based on the Hellenistic world. Matter of fact, that's why the New Testament is written in Greek, because the whole world was Hellenized. So we know that the Bible says that the prince that shall come, the Antichrist, is going to come out of the people, because Daniel actually prophesied back in his day that the second temple would be destroyed. And that's what Jesus said would happen, and it happened in AD 70. And he said about that back then that the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the temple and the sanctuary. And they did. And who did that in AD 70? The Romans, who are also an extension of the Greeks, who was really built by Alexander the Great. And the Seleucid dynasty continued to Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who was the first in the real line of the Antichrist people. We got a few minutes left here. Let's review now, and this is what I wanted you to do. Please turn to chapter 8, Daniel chapter 8, verses 3 to 9. I think we'll end up here, because this is, I actually have a couple of quotes I'd like to read you, so we're getting close to the end of chapter 8. I'd like to wrap that up today. I hope you find this as fascinating as I do, because, like I said, this is the second time I've taught this, but it is always fresh to me, and it's always wonderful. So I hope you're enjoying this too, but anyway. So turn to Daniel chapter 8, verses 3 to 9. Now, as we read this, I want you to know that what you know, what we just discussed in this last 40 minutes here, what you know. Now let's read it and see how easy Scripture is to interpret once you know the rest of the story. So let's read this together. Daniel chapter 8 and verse 3. I looked up, this is Daniel speaking, and there before me was a ram with two horns. Look at the map. That's Medo-Persia. Standing beside the canal. And the horns were long. They had a great reach. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later, Medes and Persians. I watched the ram as he charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could withstand him. This is Alexander the Great in his 20s, as he's conquering everything. Going fast, conquering quickly. No animal could stand against him, and none could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. Alexander the Great. So now that you know all we talked about, this should be very clear. Anyway, verse 6. He came toward the two-horned ram, Media and Persia, I had seen standing beside the canal, and charged at him in great rage. I saw him attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering his two horns, defeating Media and Persia. The ram was powerless to stand against him, the goat. The goat knocked him to the ground and trampled on him, and none could rescue the ram from his power. That's the transition right there being talked about from the silver to the bronze time period. And notice the date, 330 BC, and I told you that was the time of Alexander the Great. Verse 8, the goat became very great, but at the height of his power, when there was no more world to conquer, which we know, that's what happened, his large horn was broken off. So the head of the Grecian power at the time, the large horn, Alexander the Great, of this ram, of this goat, was broken off, and in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up out of this goat, this powerful Grecian goat, headed up by Alexander, and now these guys, which you know who these are because we talked about them. And in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. And we know, going back to this map, we see the 4 winds of heaven. It just, all the 4 ordinal points of the compass, basically. Out of one of them came another horn, which started small, but grew great in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. Now, I hope that that was easily interpreted by you. You see that it's all here. And now that we understand the history, it's all plain, and Scripture is very easy to interpret once you see what the history is. I want to read you a couple of quotes about this, and then we're going to stop for the night. You may have heard of C.I. Scofield. He wrote the Scofield Bible. His name was Cyrus Ingersoll Scofield. He lived from 1843 to 1921. He was a Bible student and author, was privately educated. He converted or became Christian at age 36, was ordained in 1882. He pastored the First Church of Dallas for a couple of times. He spent his later years lecturing on biblical subjects on both sides of the Atlantic. The work for which he is best remembered is his 1909, and I want to make this clear, dispensational, premillennial Scofield Reference Bible. I want to read you his commentary on this little horn. And this is what he said. The little horn here is a prophecy fulfilled in Antiochus Epiphanes, BC 175, who profaned the temple and terribly persecuted the Jews. And that's what we just talked about. So he knows history too, and this is why he's writing this commentary, because he's telling us exactly what we now know. He is not to be confounded with the little horn of Daniel 7, which I was talking to you. This is the Antichrist, who is yet to come, and who right now is still yet to come, but a lot sooner now, because it's later than when he wrote this, and who will dominate the earth during the Great Tribulation. But Antiochus is a remarkable type of the beast, which is another name for the Antichrist, the terrible little horn of the last days. Verses 24 and 25 go beyond Antiochus and evidently refer to the little horn of Daniel chapter 7. Both Antiochus and the beast, but the beast preeminently, are in view in verses 24 and 25. And that's what I'm saying. Is this one is leading to the other. One is a foretype of the other, which is greater. The little horn of Daniel 7 cannot be the little horn of Daniel chapter 8, verses 9 through 13 and 23. It's evident. The former comes up among the 10 horns, that's the real Antichrist, into which the fourth empire, Rome, and if you go back to the map, you'll see the end times, iron and clay, that's the resurrected Roman Empire. Okay, that's what he's talking about here. Cannot be the little horn of Daniel 8 is evident. The former comes up among the 10 horns into which the fourth empire is divided. The little horn of Daniel 8 comes out of one of the 4 kingdoms into the third Grecian Empire. We know those 4 kingdoms were the dynasties of Ptolemies and Seleucid and so forth, you see. And in the latter time of the 4 kings, this was historically true of Antiochus Epiphanes. They are alike in hatred of the Jews and of God, and in the profaning of the temple. Antiochus Epiphanes comes out of Syria, pointing back through the Seleucids, the Seleucid dynasty, from which he came, one of the 4 notable kingdoms into which Alexander's empire was divided. So I think we're going to stop here. We'll continue from this point next time. I hope you enjoyed this study as much as I love studying this book, especially if you're watching the news and if you've been looking into prophecy. Well, at least a little bit. If you've studied prophecy, if you see what's going on around you now, it is amazing. It is amazing where we are. And all of this, we're studying it right now. I'm going to say good night. Thank you so much. And email if you have any questions. Bye-bye.